ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to Focus on Liberia. This is yet another edition of the Literary Hour with Jackie and Dennis. We continue from last week on our topic. This time, we're going to be treating the faces of Liberian literature. We want to welcome all our viewers from across the globe. Jackie, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Dennis. Well, it's good to be here again. Yeah.
And it's Friday, you know, the starting of the weekend. To other people, it's the beginning of the week. How's the start of your weekend?
Yep. Still inside, still social distancing.
Right. And let's see how we can make this all part of literature. I want to welcome our viewers from across the globe. This is the Literary Hour. Today, we're going to be discussing the faces of Liberian literature, but we want to start with a little recap of what we did last week, especially with the faces. We started on a general note, and then we discussed part of the faces in Liberian literature. And when we talk about faces, we look at almost in everything we have faces. So Liberian literature did not start the way it is today. We went through, some forms. And it's very important also to note that art in itself, at some point you do things, at other point, let's say, look at music, for instance. At some point, people sing certain kind of music. Another point, they will move through. So things do not continue to be the same. And that's the same way with literature. So Liberian literature has been going through phases, and we are at a certain phase today. We started with a couple. So we're going to do a recap. Jackie, first let's discuss, faces in different walks of life and how we can link that to literature. I think everything has faces, and literature is no exception.
I agree with you. Just how history and national development is fluid. The literature, which reflects what's happening in the country at the time, is also fluid. So there's nothing stagnant about the literary canon. It evolves just like the history of a country. So I agree with you on that.
Right. And I noticed, and sometimes I said, let's take the music, for instance, even our gospel music, at a certain time in Liberia, especially after the war, it's like everybody was angry with everybody and suspecting the next one of being the enemy. So you have songs in church like, the hole you dig for me, I jump over it.
Yes.
So it's like things are moving through a time when we are happy and people are singing love songs. Sometimes the people get angry, or they're angry with society or people in leadership. And so things continue to change. The songs they sing at that time will change. And so it's the same way with literature. At some point, the writers, even though they are at different parts of the world or the country, they kind of pick up the same theme or write about something similar at that particular point. And so we started last week with looking at the faces in Liberian literature. And what we started with was, let me look at my note, the literature of the pastoral and the folklores.
Yes.
And I can very much relate to that, and those folklores, at that time, that was like the pre-1800s, things not written, and stories are told from one generation to the other. We sat near the fire heart in the villages, and we hear stories, folklores, why goat has a short tail, why chicken drink small water, and things like that. So that was a phase.
Yeah, why mosquito has a small waist.
Exactly.
I remember that one. Yeah.
And we also spoke about literature of discovery. That's from the mid 1800s.
Yes.
And it came down to a time for identity and nationalism. Yep. Before the Tumblr era, where literature was around unification and integration. So let's quickly summarize those phases that we discussed, and then we can start with what we'll be discussing today.
Okay, yeah. So we just discussed, or we summed up oral literature, and then we talked about one that Prof. Nangbe called identity and discovery, or literature of the elites, which I call historical and colonial. So what we're trying to do now is just identify a few writers. I know there are a lot of writers during those times, but we cannot name every one of them.
Right.
So the identity and discovery, we said that we got a lot of our literary evolution from journals, from diaries, and from letters that they wrote back across the ocean for the settlers. So one of the, or probably the best known of that time was the 1891, which is Liberia's first novel, Guyana Pau, which was about a young woman who did not want to marry someone who was 20 years older than her. You know, I mean, it's incredible that Joseph Walters will write a story, which I call a feminist novel, you know, about a young lady trying to chart her own path.
Yeah.
Around that time also, we have Edward Wilmot Blyden, who is also well known. And then in the 1930s, we have Charles Cooper. A lot of people know him as Vafeli Kali. That was the name he wrote on A Love in Ebony. And when we talk about history and literature coming to intersecting, Charles Cooper, in his book on Love in Ebony, you will see that although it's a love story, he also reflects what he reflected what was happening at the time, because within that book, you also have a guy who goes to Fernando Po. And if you remember, in the 1930s, that's when the Fernando Po crisis came up, the scandal, right? The slave labor on the cocoa plantations in Fernando Po. So Charles Cooper brought that out also in his novel, Love in Ebony. And then we talk about unification and integration, which was the phrase of the time, where Jayne Moore, on the one hand, talked about extolling all things that was traditional. And then we had others who were calling the traditional values and things primitive. So we had those two disconnect. And then we also had people like Roland Dempster, right? The Mystic Reformation of Gondolai.
Your favorite.
We talk about Jayne Moore, Murder in the Cassava Patch, who also wrote Gola Boy in America. And one thing we forgot to mention was Sangawolo, right? Sangawolo, his first novel, The Rain and the Night, it talked about the war between the Pele and the Gola. You know, it ended happily, but that was a historical novel in itself. You know, so we talked about those things, and we said that this period, although the government was pushing reintegration, it wasn't really reintegration and unification. It was trying to get the indigenous people to be integrated into the settler or the elite, and not extolling everything that was traditional. So those were the phases that we talked about.
Right. And anytime we talk about those phases, we look at novels or stories, but we should also mention about some poems that were written. I remember Yana Jews of Water Street by Jayne Moore.
Yeah, and he wrote a lot. He wrote Liberian Market Women. There's something, that was one that he wrote also. And actually you could, even it's funny to see the different styles, whereas Blyden, Barclay, and at times Roland Dempster, they use flowery words, of starry hosts in young London. Jayne Moore and the others, they use very simple English, English that the average Liberian will understand, So they differ also not only in their portrayal of the Liberian society, they also differed in the way they wrote their short stories and poems.
And we can put that in identity and nationalism. What do you think?
Yeah, it's identity literature. Actually, you will see as we go along that some of them intersect.
Right, they called it.
Yeah, like Roland Dempster, right? It can be unification and reintegration, but it's also, I was looking at it and I said, oh, this could be protest literature.
Right.
Dempster, the Mystic Reformation of Gondolai, it's attacking the norm, right? It's attacking the corruption of the day, but very careful not to say this is about Liberia, right? It was about Gondolai, and this young boy Blama was trying to get rid of the corruption and to find this place where everything was well, like Miseria, So he did write a satire, but it was also very, it condemned the corruption of the day, but he was careful to set it in a fictional country.
Yeah.
So it was protest literature also.
Right, and we'll get to protest. That's our first we're going to start with tonight. But the reason we're saying this also is there are some school of thought out there that sometimes say, and we also said on the first day that at the end we want our viewers to answer the question: does Liberia have a literary culture?
Yes.
There are some out there say, well, Liberians don't write. There are no books. And you always like to point out that the first novel, yes, African novel, was written by a Liberian.
Yep. And I can show it right here.
Exactly.
Yes.
So there are a lot of writings out there. There are a lot of books and other forms of literature being written by Liberians. Our goal here is to bring, to introduce them to you. And what we're going to do tonight is to mention them as we discuss the phases in Liberian literature. So,
and I will beg their indulgence also, because there's such a lot to go through that Dennis and I, we're going to be referring to our notes every now and then. So just to let them know.
Right. And we're going to open the phone lines because this is something new that we are starting. We want everyone to participate. We have a lot of writers out there and people that read Liberian books, Liberian literature. Call and share your experience, put your comments, and let's discuss. No one has a monopoly of knowledge. We can all discuss and see where we go from here. So if you are just joining us, this is Focus on Liberia. We are discussing the literary hour. Tonight is phases of Liberian literature. One of the where we're going to start tonight is the literature of protest literature. Key word there is protest. This is a word that a lot of us during this political season we are familiar with, but protest is not only going in the street and say, we don't want this person, or we're not satisfied with this. Also in literature, people protest, or people continue to protest with their writing. And that's the phase we're going to start with tonight. And so, Jackie, you can pick it up from here.
Okay, so I will be situating the protest literature within what's happening in Liberia at the time, what was happening, and also what was happening in the world. So if we look at protest literature, I will start by quoting Wole Soyinka, right? He says, when the writer in his own society can no longer function as a conscience, right? He must recognize that his choice lies in denying himself totally or withdrawing to the position of chronicler and post-mortem surgeon. And Kelly says, art does not reproduce what we see. It makes us see. So now we come to what was happening in the time. So in 1943, right, we had 96 years of independent Liberia, right? The national revenue was how much? Only $1.5 million. We had only one company, which was Firestone. So Tubman decided to do an open door policy where he invited a lot of investors in the country. And it worked because history tells us that during the 1950s, Liberia had the greatest percentage increase in per capita GNP in the world and was exceeded only by Japan at the time. Can you believe that, Dennis?
Yeah.
Yeah. So and Tubman also, he was very aware that the indigenous people believed that the settlers had exploited them, right? So he presented a counter narrative. Whenever he would speak or he would talk about, how they work together they fought for the same cause, right? And the settlers obtained these deeds of secession with transfer title, not to the settlers, but to the country, Liberia, right? And then, if you remember, he also designated January 7th as Pioneers' Day, right? Remember Pioneers' Day, right? So it was all about crafting this counter narrative to how the settlers were feeling. And in 1946, on the Independence Day, I would quote a passage from his speech. He said, "It was to be expected, and it is understandable that the lords of the soil, who had remained for centuries living their own primitive way, knowing nothing of payment of taxes, content with their primitive methods anyway and way of life and administration, with no desire for change, development, or progress." So it tells you again that this integration was just a superficial one. It wasn't real integration. If it was integration, it was a one-sided integration. So we have all of these things happening, and then we had people. Don't forget, Tubman was a ruler, so people were afraid to write, right? I mean, there's Dempster trying to cloud what he's writing, right? So around this time, let's say in the 1930s going up, we have something happening among the Francophone countries, right? The Francophone, if you remember, when the French colonized countries in Africa, it was no indirect rule like Britain, right? It was assimilation.
Right.
They wanted you to be a Frenchman, and so you had to assimilate. So the people who were,
that assimilation is assimilating into French.
Yes, you have to be the perfect Frenchman. You have to speak the best French. But there were some young people, Léopold Senghor, Aimé Césaire, and Léon Damas, right, who were in France at the time, and they rebelled, right? They coined a literary and ideological movement called negritude. And negritude takes pride in Blackness, traditional values, right? Césaire said negritude is not absence, it is refusal. He said a simple recognition of the fact that one is Black, the acceptance of this fact and of our destiny as Black, as Black, of our history and our culture. It is a reconquest of the self by the self. And words are the essential element through which you find yourself. So, of course, during that time in negritude, there was a lot of poems being written and things like that. And don't forget, in the United States, they had the Harlem Renaissance, right? Yeah. So it was all this thing of a celebration of Blackness. So we come back to Liberia, and at that time, people are still writing, right? But they are writing flowery praise to Tubman. Roland Dempster, I was shocked to learn that although he wrote the Mystic Reformation of Gondolai, he wrote flowery Shad Tubman. Tubman is the man we want. Sorry.
Right. Ladies and gentlemen, if you just joined us, we are discussing protest literature or the literature of protest. Go ahead, Jack.
Yeah. So I'm sorry. Yeah. So anyway, we have Tubman. At that time, sorry, they say my internet is unstable. I don't know what that means. Hopefully nothing. Okay, so we talk about Tubman trying to write a counter narrative to what existed at the time, right? And then around that time, also in 1964, the Society of Liberian Authors was incorporated by a legislative act. Its aim was to stimulate general interest in writing, right? Mm-hmm. But Tubman also inherited something from Berkeley. He inherited Albert Port. So we come now to the premier, to the doyen of protest literature in Liberia, Albert Port, right? And there's a saying, courage is found in the cracks of history, but in the everyday. Albert Port was a fearless critic, right? He had criticized Berkeley, and now he was criticizing Tubman, and when I say criticize, he was criticizing the excesses that were happening at the time, right? Do you remember Albert Port, Dennis?
Yeah, I do. I was in Monrovia when he passed away, and his burial was like a protest, big one.
Yep. He always carried with him, they said, a toothbrush, because he never knew if he would spend time in a prison or at home, right? So
and before we even get to that, we're talking about, Tubman had this counter narrative like, hey, everything we have here now has both indigenous people and the settlers. We all want, even though whatever land we took from you is for all of us, right?
Yes.
And at that time,
Yes.
because of the strong grip on power, people were using these flower rolls that you talk about. And one of those was written by Mrs. Dacina King Draper, who was head of a
Okay.
lady group in Sino. And the poem was, why Liberian must love Tubman. It says something like, listen and hear, oh hear.
Yes.
You wicked, jealous, senseless, and ambitious, selfish, and deceitful, handful Liberian plotters. If you love our glorious land of freedom, you must love Tubman. And she went on and on. If you like faith, you must love Tubman. So, under
You must love Tubman.
strong grip on power, all you have to do is to praise him. Now, but you said he inherited Ivor Port from Barclay.
Yep. And so Aberport, right? He was fearless. I mean, this guy. I was like, oh God. Every time I'm like, so he was the editor. He published articles in the Cruiserville Observer, right? And he wrote about things that were happening in the government, like for example, thinking about the unthinkable things the democratic way. And mind you, this was he wrote by hand. Most of these things he wrote by hand. And he would. And so he published that because he said that Liberia was a poor country. Why was Tubman buying a yacht at that time? So he wrote about that. And of course, this man is like, a giant for the times, and President Tubman always responded, right?
Yeah.
Said to him, that Port was a grumbler. You make no contribution or make so little contribution to the resources of the country that you should be ashamed to talk about the public expenditure, So, and then he will fire back at Tubman, and then they will fire him from his job. He was a school teacher, and then they will bring him back, and then they will fire him again, right? And then at one time they were taking his money, right, from his paycheck, because there was one party, the True Week Party, and everybody was to pay, taxes that went. And he said, I'm not a member of the True Week Party, and should not therefore be forced to contribute to its funds. You see, President Tubman, in his recent visits abroad, made it clear that unlike Ghana, ours is not a one-party state by law. So while it is a fact that my salary was refunded to me in the past when I raised the question of non-membership, I feel it is humiliating and tyrannical for such requests for a refund should be made amidst the circumstances. This guy was fearless. When Tubman's brother was finance minister, I think Stephen Talbot, right?
You said
He wrote about, right? It was he wrote about Liberianization of gobbling business, right? And Stephen Talbot sued him. And it's interesting to note that when Stephen Talbot sued him, who was judge at the time, James A. Pierre, who was actually Talbot's father-in-law. But he didn't recuse himself.
Right.
And he said that Aberport should pay $125,000 or $250,000, right, in damages. But you see, this was the society was so outraged at what was happening to Aberport that it is considered Liberia's first civil society organization, Citizens of Liberia in Defense of Aberport. So this man was, this was protest literature at its best, And then we have Jayne Moore, right? The imprisoned native. So Jayne Moore wrote this story about Flomo, a young Pella boy who had he had gotten instructions from the woman he lived with and worked for, Mrs. Depot, who told him to go and light a cannon, right? And I think he crisscrossed the instructions and he lit the cannon, but it killed Mr. Depot. So Flomo ended up in jail. What makes it very interesting and what makes it take its place in protest literature is because Mr. Depot was an educated man, and very high in society. And Flomo, in the book, he says, God knows that I didn't mean to do it, but no American Liberian police officer would believe a Pella man like me for killing one of their prominent citizens. Even as I sat condemned to death and imprisoned behind rusty bars at the Central City prison, I'm even more convinced that obedience makes free men slaves. all I thought I was doing was obeying instructions. I had obeyed and become a murderer or a hero, So actually, it's funny because I investigated, and after this story, the imprisoned native, Jayne Moore, who was a journalist at the Ministry of Information, he was fired.
Yeah.
He lost his job. So it's very interesting, but it's also important to note that although there's protest literature, there were other literature coming out, other types of literature. Like Tuan Ray wrote The Love of Liberty. Don't forget that. And we have Simile Carter, who wrote So Say One, So Say All. We have Robert Brown with The Applicants, G. Henry Andrews, Cry, Liberia, Cry, and Lifted Up. So the phase lasted through several periods of civil unrest.
Don't forget Dr. Baba.
Yeah, I'm coming to that. And full-blown civil war, right? So among the plays, we had Kona Kaishu, we had Peter Bala, we had Womi Neal, and we had, of course, Joe Baba, right? And we have Robert Brown. We had short stories by Patricia Jabez Wesley, Doris Bank Henrys, who wrote Poems of Liberia, right? Ernest Jerome Yancey, History, Abiami Cassell, History, right? And it says a nation survives through its culture, right? So we also have Peter Dole, Fatima Masekwe Famula's book, Jangaba Johnson. Remember Jangaba Johnson? We talked about him in the first phase, the folklore of the Gola, the folklore of the Vai, right? He published it, in the late 1950s. But all of these were books that were coming out that were talking about the history, the traditions, and the customs of the people. So I wanted to mention also that we had Kona Kashu wrote Kanda Goto of Swen. I don't know if you remember that, Manja Asuma. Yeah. And you do know Robert Brown, After a Long Silence, right?
Robert H. Brown, yeah.
Robert H. Brown, yeah, After a Long Silence, right? So and then in 1965, but in 2005, a group of Liberians came together to form the Liberian Writers Network, right? And the members included Wilton Sanga, Wolo Ophelia, Louis, K. Moses Nangbe, Ray Martin To, Stephanie Horton, Robert Cisse, among others. And then I wanted to talk about Amos Sawyer's book in his preface to Effective Immediately, Dictatorship in Liberia. He states that it is important that the accounts of both players and observers be recorded, not only to get the full story, but more importantly, to initiate a vigorous and incisive debate out of which approaches to solutions can emerge. So the books that were coming out at the time, yes, there were many that dealt with history and tradition, but we always say these are the important books that came out at that time, are the important writers that came out at that time. So for the literature of protest, the writers would be Jayne Moore and Albert Port.
And Jackie, it's always important to, as you said, to situate this within what's happening at a time. So like we spoke about Tadmore's strong grip on power. So coming the death of Tadmore, now we have President Tolbert, who is more liberal and open. And as a result, people started writing more. So there's more protest.
Yes, people started writing more because that's when Tuan Ray wrote his book, right? People were writing because Tolbert was a more accommodating, you go ahead of state as opposed to Tolbert, So yeah, at that time that people were writing, but not the protests. They were more like little leaflets or pamphlets. You know how you used to remember we used to get those things and people would just put it down and you don't know where it's coming from. So those were protest literature, but people were not putting their names on it. People were not signing their names to anything. So it's protest literature. But like we said, since we can't find everybody, the most important, and Tuan Ray also, we shouldn't forget Tuan Ray. Tuan Ray was very courageous at the time. Yeah, so.
He fought Tadmore.
And K. Moses Nangwe also, right? K. Moses Nangwe wrote at that time also. He He wrote Thinking Through the Times.
Yeah. Professor Nambi always had a way of writing some short things. Even when he wrote an article in the newspaper, it was some form of protest.
Yes.
I remembered he wrote in an article and he talked about the king or the chief. He said the chief who will always refuse for the people to advise him, he can come home with toilet on his garment because you are refusing to be advised, right? So when they find that there's something undesirable on your clothes, people are so afraid to talk to you.
They wouldn't tell you, yeah.
Yeah. That was protest.
Yes. Yeah, that was protest. And I think he wrote a poem, Everything Chakla. Yes, he wrote a poem. Yeah.
Oh, was that him? So, ladies and gentlemen, we'll be opening our phone lines and we'll put that on the screen so that you can join the discussion. We are discussing phases of Liberian literature. What we are talking about now is protest literature. And we gave you some names of people who wrote at that time. And it's important to know that while we are talking about phases, it does not mean that within this phase, only this form of literature is available. There are still other forms that are being written, but we're just saying predominantly this is what you see. And it's based on what is happening at that time.
Yeah.
And if there's any book that we're not going to mention all as we said, but if something strikes you and you want to mention that, please call or comment and let's make that part of the discussion. So from protest, where we go next, Jackie? I think we go to the next.
We go to the one that actually I would say that we're still in that phase, which is the literature of exile and dispersion, and remembrance, right? So the war brought with it a new phase, right? So this literature of dispersion and exile, right? It brought about the vocabulary of war. Yeah. And yet the writers remember history, tradition, culture, and family, right? So the novel in itself, or the writings that were coming out, were searching for this holy grail, which is what? This Liberia, right? That they knew, this Liberia that was missing, right? So it's like we're doing literature, and I really like quoting things because then it situates it, right? So the war happened, people dispersed. And they say that sometimes exile is indeed a place. It's a new found land, to borrow the name of that desolate space, a wasteland, right? That this is a Soyinka. For tropical blood like mine must have been a naming ceremony, right? The wanderer shakes the dust of habitation off his feet, right? And as people are traveling, what are they doing? They are bitterly mourning their exile, right? They're longing for return, right? And I always think about Dante's Exile in Paradiso, when he says, "You will lose everything you love most dearly." That is the arrow that exile's bow will fire. You will prove how bitter the taste of another man's bread is, and how hard it is to descend and climb another man's stairs. And I always think of that when I read the literature that's coming out now, right? Because
Jackie, before we go to the reflection, we have that the literature of dispersion and exile.
Yes.
Is that what we're talking about now, or reflection?
Yes, that's what we're talking about.
Oh, okay. Because
people dispersed.
Yeah, when we disperse, and practically, and you can think about it, because we go into this, and I was one of them. We go into this refugees land. So what do? The first thing is when we went there, it's like, this is who we are. And the people are looking at us, say, you think you were all that? Look at you now, right? So within that state, what do you think about? You start to miss home. You start to think, where you come from and where you are now. And even the songs we were singing, even when we went to church, our songs were different. Those were different from the songs we sang. We were very despondent. you are now being subdued, and so the only hope you have as a believer is God. So what do you say? Everything is praise, and so when you're in exile, especially being very new, that form of literature is going to be different.
Yeah, and something happens during that time. Either you begin to idealize, right, your country, like everything was good
Yeah.
at the time.
Until the people ask you, I said, but wait now, this Liberia you came from, was there any, no poor man was in Liberia?
Yes,
All of you
yes,
were rich.
yes. You begin to idealize where you're coming from. That there's no country that was as good as Liberia, or you do what? You get a total rejection. You know, you see people who say, I don't even want to think about Liberia. So you get all the in betweens of some people who are saying it was good and it was bad, but you get more people saying, oh, it was extremely good, or you get people saying it was extremely bad. Sometimes it depends on where you are situated at the time, you know. So this I call it searching for the Holy Grail. But the literature that was coming out at that time, we had a lot of historical books, memoirs. Memoirs were coming out, right? People were talking about other people's life. We have Lifted Up, the Victoria Talbot story, right? We have K. Moses Nangbe, right? Just like yesterday, historical book, A Short History of Sasstown of the 1960s, right? We have another memoir by Mary Antoinette Brown Sherman, Jayne Moore, The Life and Times of Victoria Elizabeth Jayne Moore, her mother, who was married to, I think, Louis Arthur Grimes. We have a book like another memoir, From Foya to the Capital, His Excellency Joseph Newman Boykai, right? That's in this period also. That's Sakwi Malakpa. We have one of the best known, The House at Sugar Beach, right? By Helen Cooper. We have that. We have books like The Village Boy, again by Sakwi Malakpa. Poems from the Ashes of War by Jeremiah Mayunga, right? We have a lot of books of poetry coming from Patricia Jabbeh Wesley, Before the Palm Could Bloom, Becoming Ebony, The River is Rising, Where the Road Turns, you know. And then we have a poem, we have lots of poems. We have poems from K. Moses Nangbe, when those we crave don't return, right? It talks about the diaspora story, those immigrants who huddle abroad, dreaming, twisting like pretzels for home. We have Anjiple Chebo, who talks in his We Wait, right? He ends his poem with, yes, we wait and we wait. So you find that a lot of people are in this waiting place. They're waiting for things to be better so they can go home. It's reflected in the literature, or they're waiting for something to shift. So we're always in this waiting place. But then we have books like Wayatu Moore, right? She Who Would Be King, right? Who talks about the traditions, the history of Liberia. First she talks about the repatriation of slaves, but then she also talks about resilience. We have Bessa, Junde, right, and Norman. And, three different individuals who portray three different aspects of Liberia. We have Vamba Sharif, right, the kingdom of Siba, but he talks about the land of our fathers, right? So all of these are a return to Liberia, a return to history, a return to probably looking for that which was lost, right? So I always say that Professor Patricia Jabbeh Wesley, even her books, the titles chronicle the evolution of the nation, right? Before the palms could bloom, Becoming Ebony, Where the Road Turns, The River is Rising, When the Wanderers Come Home. All of those are titles that when you read it, it's almost like an evolution of what we are going through, from dispersion to return. So many of these are books that, that reflect this. I call it this waiting place. It's exile, right? But it's exile, and it's like it seems as if even though the writers cannot return at this time, they are going to wait, but the longing is reflected in the literature. I was showing you that we have a a lot of books, I've been collecting that just talk about waiting. I want to go home, this home, or they become historical, and talk about, when the free slaves came back, or they talk about the tradition, or they talk about the tradition and the secular coming together. But we always see that it's always about this longing for return.
Miata Heron mentioned another book, Prince Raphael Black Mayflower.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. And we have history books coming out, Liberia and the United States during the Cold War, written by Dr. Elwood Dunn, so we have a lot of books coming out at that time. So that is the phase of exile. I would say longing for return, not so much return, but longing for return.
Let me just read a comment here. Franklin Willa say, I'm wondering whether Kona Cashew didn't do some literary work. Maybe he missed our first part when we talk of Kona Cashew.
We did mention him. As a playwright. I mentioned him about he talked about we mentioned him when we talked about what is the name when we talked about Joe Baba and the others. We did mention him. Maybe he did. He did.
Yeah, you must have. Yeah. And Professor Nambe's book on Buck Challenge.
Okay.
When they went
that in itself is a voyage, right? It's a metaphor, right? It's a voyage. The writings, if you look at them metaphorically, they're all like a passage, right? Either from exile to home or from home to exile. It becomes a passage of self from one to the other. Yeah.
Let me check if. So, ladies and gentlemen, this is Liberian literature. This is our literary hour. We are discussing the phases of Liberian literature. We talk about the literature of pastoral and folklore, literature of discovery. We talk about the literature of identity and nationalism, literature of unification and integration that was before. So today we started with the literature of protest. From protest literature, we went to the literature of dispersion and exile. And if you want to join, please, the number is on the screen. Please call that code. That's the code is 791443. The number to call is 605-313-6004. You can comment and be part of the discussion. So now we are dispersed in exile. Sitting in exile, what do you remember? You reflect and think about your villages, your town, your home, how life was. And so we put that in the category of the literature of reflection, remembrance, and still that longing to return.
Yes, and oftentimes, it's almost like if you're looking at it, it's almost like death in a way, right? Somebody dies, and you always say everything good about the person. Oh, that man was very good. So it's like that. It's a little death. You've left your home. You've come to an unknown land. So you look back and you say, oh no, life was good. So you almost idealize, that which even took you away, but you still idealize that. So then we come now, to the literature of belonging and return, right? So that's our little phase that we're, so Chimamanda says that the ideas of return, they are either intentional or actual, right? They are either imagined, but they have become a consistent feature of the literature of Africa and the African diaspora. So African literature has represented returnness in various ways, including feeling located in an ideal home, having a sense of belonging, being alienated in a country that they can no longer recognize, or experiencing this multiplacedness through feeling at home, but not declaring a place as home. It's like I think Mandela has said that there's nothing like returning to see how you've changed, right? So people they were writing about how wonderful Liberia was in that time, and some of them are returning home, right? But is it the reality that they're seeing? I think somebody's trying to call.
Yeah, let's get our first caller. And Jackie, we need to mention too that it's not everybody who is looking at Liberia has this place that you want it to be. There are still people who think like, I don't even want to go there.
Yes.
So let's get our first caller. Caller, your name and where you calling from. Welcome to the conversation. Hello, caller, calling from last 4 digit 8025. Your name and where you calling from.
Yes, hi, this is Artemis Gay, Chicago, Illinois.
Dr. Gay, welcome to Focus on Liberia. This is the Literary Hour. Let's talk.
Thank you. I was just browsing through, and this is very refreshing. And my good friend, Jackie, thank you so much. You are indeed a resourceful person. And so I just couldn't hesitate to make a call and just thank you for bringing such a brilliant program on. I mean, this is just beautiful, especially with the tense time we have in our country, Liberia, and even the U.S., to have such a refreshing mind or to reflect on these beautiful literature or the time of our history. So again, I have nothing much to say, but just to remind you, and just want to remind you about one book, even though we're not written by a Liberian, but it's very powerful. And I have a new book coming up on that subject. It's called Prince Among Slaves, which I've seen the PBS documentary. But we're going beyond that story to be told, because it is told within an American setting of the Democratic Party, formed in 1828, with Andrew Jackson and a young old Fulani guy who will live and die in Liberia. So I just wanted to just let you know it is so beautiful that we can reflect on historical context and make that to show its present reality in our lives as a nation, as a people. So again, thank you so much.
And Dr. Again, I didn't get it clearly.
Oh, sorry, I didn't get the question.
What? I didn't get the name.
Oh, the book is written by my friend Terry Alpha, called Prince Among Slaves. But it has to do a lot with Liberia. And I just wrote a new book that should be coming out with University of Mississippi Press, and that would tell the story of that very subject or individual and what happened to the family history in Liberia that is almost unknown in our literature. So I just wanted to just raise that, especially with what's going on in the political arena around the USA and even in Liberia.
Thank you. That's very important you brought that up. Thanks for calling.
Thank you.
Okay.
And Jackie, before we continue, I just want to make, because the caller mentioned that it's refreshing to have this at this time in our history, because when you look at what's going on in Liberia, there's a lot of contention. There's a lot of talk. And I spoke to one historian, Dr. Brewer, we're discussing. He said, we as historians, we look at things that this has happened before, like everything is going to pass. So you have people documenting it, right? So the phase we're in right now, that it appears that the politics is so polarized, everybody at each other's throat, well, there's going to be literature coming out as a result of that period. So if you are in literature or if you are in history, you don't look at whatever period you're in as if it's going to be that way. It's going to pass and people are going to write about it, and you're going to reflect and wish that you had something written down to remember this kind of period. So I just wanted to mention that. Yeah, and literature and history, these things are so liberating because they don't tie you down to one period or point in our history. You're always looking back and looking forward, and not saying that you are static in one area. Because the reason we are talking about phases today, because things have changed over the years, things continue to evolve. And so it's important to discuss literature, even as people think that everything revolve around politics.
Yeah, we talked about that, Dennis, last time. We talked about the timelessness, the timing of a specific phase and the timelessness. Remember, we talk about Gondolai, and we talk about Jayne Moore, about the urban-rural divide. And we said that although it was situated in that phase, you could read that book today and know that, okay, and, you know, it's the same. So yeah, I agree with Dr. Brewer that, you know, history is more a pattern of things, you know, so you see it and you say, this has happened before.
Yeah.
I think the value of patterns is that, okay, here is something that happened, but what changed the trajectory, right?
Yeah.
Why did it go this way and not that way? And it is those points that I think we should recognize and study to say, okay, Liberia was going this way, but all of a sudden it turned this way. What happened? Oh, this happened at this particular time. So if this happened, that took us this way and not this way, perhaps when this occurrence happened again, we know what to do.
Exactly.
So it teaches you to look at these patterns and to learn. That's why people say you learn from history, right? You learn from history because you watch the patterns. Yeah. So about this so I called it the phase of belonging, return and belonging, because sometimes, Dennis, when we return home, let's say you've written a novel, you've extolled the virtues and the beauty of home, and you've been longing all these years to return home.
Yeah.
Sometimes when you get home, it is not what you know.
Yeah.
It is not what you know. You are a displaced returnee, because, you know, sometimes people say, oh, it's not how I imagined.
Yeah.
In the book, your words, you've imagined it one way, but belonging is characterized by identifiers, right? So this belonging orders the society, right? So now you're like, oh, what happened? You know, and they always say history is not the past, it is the present. We carry our history, right? We are our history, right?
Yeah.
Made up of all of the things that have happened to us. That's our history, right? So you can look at the nation as a text, right? And that narrative that you're reading, that text, right? It's like your face. If you look at your face, it has different contours. So you read history of a country almost like the contours of that country. But then again, with the next phase, which is belonging, we come to poems like In Monrovia, the River Visits the Sea by Patricia Jabe Wesley, and Praise Song for My Children. And in fact, one of her book of poetry, When the Wanderers Come Home,
Yeah. Let me see.
which is an excellent title for this phase, When the Wanderers Come Home. So they say that the narrative is the unfolding itinerary of a voyage. So the narrative is the voyage metaphor, right? So one of the quotes that I like to read in this phase is, what is the homeland of writers? It is the unity between a piece of ground we call home, a language and a culture, an identity realized in mind and body. It is the mosaic of an exile and of a universal transnation, right? But sometimes there's an impossibility of return, right? Exile becomes a lived experience. So sometimes, like you say, there are some people who would never return, not because they say, oh, I don't want to bother with Liberia, but due to circumstances, these people would never return, right? So the longing again is one of belonging. Like, I was once a part of this place.
Yeah.
I can no longer return, but I was once a part of this place. And James Baldwin said, the experience of a people is the only realistic basis for their salvation. So you belong, and you see that this impossibility that you cannot return makes you seek out groups. You know, like Liberians seek out other Liberians. You go to a city, you see that Liberians are always calling each other, and some of them may not return. But within this society of Liberians in the diaspora, they have found belonging, and this is where they stay. Yeah. Yeah. And then, of course, I want to read the preface to Amos Sawyer's work. He says, he said the wanderers are returning, right? So we see that they are returning, and they're bringing with them remembered pieces, right? They're bringing stories of migration and return. And I said, as a text, the Liberian society needs to be read, decoded, and continued. The text began with the migration of the griots and the settlers and continues with intermittent stops and starts, but the weaving continues. And so the literature has to continue in the weaving of a narrative that demands a different pattern in order to continue. So I can let me just end by reading this short piece. So can contemporary Liberian writers still record the mores and experiences of the society? And for whom are they still allowed to be the voice of vision in their own time? As Frantz Fanon puts it, to fight for a national culture is first and foremost to fight for the liberation of a nation. So literary works can contribute to the shaping of the national identity, as well as provide an ongoing forum for national issues and possible solutions, right? We must start writing narratives of inclusion, remembrance, return, knowing and unknowing, and all the in-betweens. So as Ali Mazrui calls it, the interplay between the tongue and the pen, between the indigenous and the imported. For those who perceive the nation as a single entity, the national literature must embrace the contribution of all, written and oral, painful and joyous. Our literature must show our lived history. We must write narratives of inclusion, right? So I just say that, that African literary narratives are at the crossroads, and Liberians must write. But in writing, I would say, while they're writing about tradition and writing about history, they must also write about lived experiences, not just history, about what went on before, what is now, and what is this new phase? What does belonging mean? I guess that is what I've been wrestling with. When you say I belong somewhere, what does that mean, really? Because once we answer that question, I'm a Liberian and I belong in Liberia. Not physically, you could belong somewhere else and still be a Liberian. But once we answer that question, once we look at the literature and say, oh, this is what belonging means, I think we are on a road to unification and true reintegration. Yes.
That was powerful. That's why I was just listening about this whole idea of belonging. And what does it mean to be a Liberian? These are things that we struggle with, and perhaps some of the issues we find because we don't find answers to these questions. And as a result, it may be reflected in the way we relate to one another, the way we act, the way we discuss, because we have not really discovered what it means to be a Liberian. And literature can help us answer that question.
Yes. As Achebe says, the writer shows you where the rain began to beat you. And that's how you know where to start wiping your skin.
Right. So there is a pool. In our background, they always conduct a pool to see where the people are. So the question here, do you love Liberian literature? Of those who voted, I think 24 persons voted. 21 said, yes, I do. Three persons represented 13% said, no, I don't. So 88% love Liberian literature, 3% or 13% say no. That's where we are, Jackie. Okay. And that's beautiful, because, and that's one reason for the program, because there are some who really think that Liberian does not have literature, or Liberians are not writing.
Yeah, I mean, if you go online, I was shocked. People would say, Liberia has no literature, so they're talking about Nigerian literature and things. Yeah. They would never, say anything about Liberian. I'm like, what are they talking? Of course, we have a literature, And I would say that people should take time to locate some of these books and read, and they tell a wonderful story, of the settler and the indigenous, and and like we say, you know, we need this to be able to move forward. We need an inclusive literature. You know, one of the things that I thought would come out of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission was more of a storytelling tradition of redemption, right? I did this, but there is redemption at the end, and we haven't seen that. But Liberian literature is still being written.
Yeah.
And the reason why I didn't bring out books like Red Dust on Green Leaves or something is because in the beginning we said that we were going to deal with literature by Liberians, whether situated within or without the country. So that's what we were dealing with. Yes.
Yeah, and we're about to close. We have 1 hour, so we're about to close. But the whole idea that people think that Liberians don't write or we don't have books, I mean, where is that coming from? Is it because those books are now recommended in Liberia, in our Liberian schools? Or is it because we don't have a reading culture? Thank God, or people like O'Neill Fort, they started a very good program in Liberia, Liberia Reads, and it's going on well. But Jackie, in your view, where is that coming from? Someone I was watching was blaming the authors, saying, why don't even the books that people are writing, they are only on Amazon? Why we don't have them in Liberia? Why don't we have, private people, organizations trying to popularize those books in Liberia? So where is this coming from that Liberians don't have books?
I don't know why they would think that, because of course we have books. Robtel Paley just wrote a book about teaching values to young kids. Baba, I think it's called. And Brenda Brewer Moore with Keep, she's doing an excellent job in instilling the love of reading for young people. I don't know if they do have a publishing house in Liberia, but you can get most of these books on Amazon, and you can get them in Liberia also. Well, some of them. So I don't know. I think that, the dearth of reading is not just in Liberia. People would pick up a video or CD instead of picking up a book. I mean, if we're going home and you yourself can bear testament to that, people, right. Oh, bring me this and bring me that. Nobody says, bring me a book. So we have to cultivate the love of reading. And like you said, and I mentioned, Brenda, and you mentioned Liberia Reads, there are a lot of startups that are doing that, and what parents could do is to read to their kids. I think it's the act of reading itself, stimulating the imagination. I remember when I went to Liberia with my daughter, and we were volunteering at an orphanage, at the Judith Craig Orphanage in Dwazon. I took a book to read, and I started to read the book. And as I read the first lines, I stopped to pass the page, and everybody in the class repeated after me what I had just said. See, so they were learning by rote, right? Memorizing, and I said, no, stop. And then I said, just listen to the story. And Dennis, after I read the story, the entire class was very quiet. You see, the words had taken them somewhere else, and little by little, they would bring a book and say, read this to me, read this to me. So it's not so much like, oh, they're not reading. Are you stimulating them? Yeah. Are you making their minds grow? Are you making them imagine something outside of themselves, And these are the things that you need to do. And we need Liberian books as well. Again, right. That same orphanage, I remember I had asked a little girl, we're talking, and I said to her, what do you love? And we're talking, we're making bracelets. And I said, what do you love? And she said, I love apples, and I love horses, and I love grapes. And I said, well, have you ever tasted an apple? And she said, no. Have you ever tasted a grape? And she said, no. And I said, do you have a horse? And she said, no. And I said, so in Liberia, what is it that you like? Right? And she went right away, mangoes and oranges, And then I said, but you've left something out. And she said, what? And I said, her name was Zoe. And I said, but you love yourself as well. And she thought about it and she said, yeah, I love myself. What I'm saying is that before you start stimulating them to that outside world, make them see, right? The writer's job is to make them see, what is in front of them, and then imagine other worlds, right? So I think that as Liberian writers start writing about things that are happening in a society and the young kids can relate to that and they get the love of reading, then they can do other and I see Brenda is doing that. So that's good. Yeah.
Great. Next week, or next Friday, we continue and we're going to be featuring one of our Liberian authors. So please be on the lookout for that. At this time, we want to thank everyone for joining us and being part of the conversation. Franklin, Wheeler, say, Dennis and Jackie, this is very good start, but we have to go further by encouraging our institutions and academicians to begin to read works from our own authors. This will help appreciate Liberian literary work. We can agree with you more, Frank. The institutions or policymakers need to recommend those books and encourage. So at least even if we're making speeches, start quoting, it gets to me, Jackie, when people start quoting Abraham Lincoln. This other person say, ask none what you're quoting. They are Liberians, author. There are tons of quotes you can quote from Liberia. You can quote from me. So stop doing that. We encourage other people, because if someone is making a speech and you quote from a Liberian author or something that a Liberian has said, someone will be, as you said, stimulated to look for that book or look for that particular article and read it. So all this will help. So we're going to be closing here tonight. Tomorrow on Focus on Liberia, we're going to be definitely at 3. First, at 2, we're going to have a political show, someone talking about why you should support your candidate. At 3, we're going to have our FOL Marketplace. At 6, we're going to have oral history of Liberia. That will be the Doe era, 1980 to 1990. And of course, midnight, we're going to have a comedy program with D. Curtis. You don't want to miss an exciting Saturday. Jackie, let's close. Your final thoughts, and then we can close the broadcast.
Well, my final thoughts, like I've always said, people should keep writing. People should keep reading. And whenever you have a book, I mean, it don't necessarily have to be a very difficult book. Read to your kids. I feel that the Liberian literary canon is still growing, that we've seen more and more writers coming up. What we need to do now is to write novels of, like I said, of inclusion. We are writing novels and we are writing history books, but we need to bring more of the literature of return, belonging. That's what we need to be focusing on now, not so much in the past. And I would say that, Liberians have been writing for a very long time, and so I would say grab the first Liberian novel, Guyana Pau, grab the second Liberian novel, Love in Ebony, read, because Liberian, we have a rich literary canon. And thank you, Dennis, for opening up this platform for us to share about it.
Thank you. It's hard to come after Jackie. So on that note, we want to say thank you for staying here with us. We don't normally leave this without playing our closing song that says, we are all Liberian. Whether you love literature or not, we are still Liberians. Whether you've been able to complete a book or not, we are all Liberians. Let's do everything we can to keep our literary culture going as Liberians. Until then, on behalf of all of us here at Focus on Liberia, my name is Dennis Jazz saying good night and God bless you. Enjoy your weekend, folks.
We are Liberian.